I am joined by an award-winning social psychologist who happens to have some great insight on social change and making change. That's Dolly Chugh. She's the author of A More Just Future: Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change. Thanks so much for joining us, Dolly.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So if you were going to give viewers kind of just a quick thought on what your book is about, what would you say?
Yeah, my book is our relationship with our past, our country's complicated history. And what I try to do is ground it in science and storytelling and fuel it with love of country.
That's fantastic. I absolutely love that. And I'm sure fueling and infusing it with truth, because that seems to be such an issue right now when we have so much history being whitewashed. And I know as a social psychologist and one who understands why people do this, I guess, can you give us an idea of really this whitewashing of history, what this looks like? What does it mean?
Yeah, there's some great research in social psychology, my field, that looks at something as simple as a football game. And when you have fans from opposing side watching a football game, how they report completely different games afterwards. And this is familiar to a lot of sports fans. One side thinks the refs was making terrible calls, the other side thinks the ref was making great calls. It's a metaphor, but it's also kind of capturing the psychology of what happens in how we tell our stories, whether it's our stories about our own families or about our ancestors or about our country's past. In the same way, we tell it from our own perspective. We see our own perspective. We see fouls or don't see fouls based on which side, if for lack of a better word, we're on or what identity we hold. And what that leads is to a limited perspective on history, particularly when the way it's carried forward is through textbooks, through cultural narratives, through media that are dominated by one perspective and not broadly representing other perspectives.
Yes, because it's the winners who end up writing history and dictating how it's told. And it does definitely seem like those who may have gotten away with a few genocides are the ones who get to dictate whether we even acknowledge them as genocides or as just spats that were easily, gotten past. And it seems that we are going to go ahead and repeat a fair amount of history if we don't have this reckoning with our history and our past. I understand that there are 7 psychological tools for reckoning with our whitewashed past, but I don't want you to give away all 7, but can you at least talk to us about one of them?
Sure, absolutely. One of them that I talk a lot about in the book is paradox. There's research on how our brains really love consistency. That tendency when you see a picture on the wall that's a little crooked, you want to straighten it, or you want to get that piece of the puzzle to fit. That's our brains trying to get things to fit and line up. That's natural. But what it means is that sometimes life is complicated and contradictory. Sometimes 2 conflicting things can both be true. For example, it is true that the forefathers of the United States of America had extraordinary vision, wrote extraordinary documents, overcame extraordinary odds. True. It is also true that many of those forefathers also were enslaving other human beings, were torturing them when they tried to escape, were separating humans from their families while they were writing those documents and crafting those visions. Both of those statements are true. That is a paradox. And one of the tools that I try to offer readers is the paradox mindset that psychologists have showed us that when we can just tell ourselves two opposing things can be true at the same time, our brain loosens up to sort of allow ourselves to be more resilient, to be more creative. And for my purposes in my book, it means that we can do some of the unlearning and relearning that we need to do in a world where paradox does exist.
That's so interesting. I think I've always been able to hold paradox in my head, and it might have been because my mother started me young and saying, people are different in different roles. Like your father might be a great father, but he's not the best husband. And they're divorced now. But let me tell you, I can hold a paradox or two. So I'm glad that you are giving others the tool to get on board for this. And so when it comes to getting people the tools that they need to be able to have this reckoning with the past, something you acknowledge is the pain of belief grief. What's that?
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking for a phrase to capture what I'm feeling often when I'm trying to. I mean, this book comes from a very personal place. It's coming from my own belief grief, which is a child of immigrants, came from India to the United States, greatest country in the world, is the narrative I've grown up with my whole life. I love this country deeply. And paradox, I've also come to realize that some of the beliefs I had about meritocracy, about our egalitarianism, about how we live up to our values, have not always been true. And so the belief grief is that just like when we grieve the loss of a person in our life, it's letting go of something that feels like it's part of us and mourning it, but then also looking for ways to move forward. And for me, what that means is these tools, like we're talking about, looking for ways to, while loving my country, still look for ways to improve it. I call it the Patriot's Dilemma, this idea that sometimes the more you love something, the harder it is to see it for what it is. And that belief grief kind of can stop us. I'm looking for what are the ways we can engage with those truths and move through that grief while acknowledging it's real.
That's a very interesting conflict there, and that need for that reckoning, and it makes sense. And I've never thought about it before then, and maybe it's the privilege of somebody who did grow up here, but that thought of being an immigrant and you have these hopes and dreams, and you uproot your entire life on this foundational belief and this thought that it's going to be better here, only to finally, unfortunately, come to that realization that you may have been safer where you were. There may have been more opportunity where you were, or at least that the system in which you have brought yourself is not that it's all cracked up to be. That must be pretty intense.
Yeah, and in my personal experiences, I think I've been protected from a lot of those tougher realities in my own personal experience, but we know that's not true for everybody. And the narrative, is that the streets are paved with gold in the United States. And there's no doubt there is so much this country offers so many of us that I know I sometimes very much take for granted. But the idea is, I think of it as like, just like we don't want to, if you're a parent, only see the Instagrammed version of your kids. You can love your kids, but not like everything they do, and look for ways to help them be better, be as good as they could possibly be. The same is true, I think, for our country. We don't want to just love the Instagrammed version, that, the sort of distant immigrant version of it. We want to love the real version. And even when we don't like everything here, look for ways to help it be as good as it can be.
Absolutely. And accountability, as well as ensuring that a nation does have the opportunities to be better and to live up to its promise. That would definitely be a reflection of love. And I think a lot of people think that critique and that criticism is a reflection of disdain, when that's not necessarily the case at all. And I know that you talk about in your book being a gritty patriot. What's that look like?
Yeah, and I just love how you just articulated that, coming from a place of love. Yes, and grit, let's add to that. So Angela Duckworth, psychologist behind the concept of grit, defines it as passion, think love, and perseverance in pursuit of a meaningful long-term goal. So let's think of patriotism as a meaningful long-term goal. And it's not just something we wear or holidays we celebrate, it's something we do, we're actively involved in. So being a gritty patriot is putting that passion and perseverance to work on a regular basis in pursuit of this meaningful long-term goal. To me, that feels very hopeful. It makes me feel like there's a path forward, that it's not either I love my country or I don't. It's that I am actively engaged in loving and improving my country all the time. And that grittiness is what we do in the rest of our lives. Like in our jobs, we have to be gritty. We have to sort of have lots of passion and perseverance to keep getting better with our families and our communities. We do this in lots of elements of our life. What if we also did it with our country in a way where we don't feel like we're just entitled to an easy love of country, but that we can pursue it with this gritty patriotism?
Yeah, and I would think that a lot of that, in terms of a country and its future, would have to do with the reckoning of the past to get everyone on board to work together. But if people are unwilling to acknowledge and to connect the dots between those past events and the reality of the present, which is something that you also address in the book, it seems like the opportunity for growth, for a unified front, that can be something that may not necessarily come to fruition. And after these last several years that have been just horrific for so many of us, it seems like a lot of people would benefit from your book, for that renewed sense of patriotism and love, which is something I think we can hopefully all get on board. And so I know it just launched earlier this week, so congratulations on your launch date. And so for people who are out there that want to get their hands on A More Just Future, where should they go?
Oh, thank you so much. It's in all the bookstores around you and all the online booksellers, independent bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. And you can always visit my website, dollychugh.com, and find information there as well.
Fantastic. That is Dolly Chugh, social psychologist and author of A More Just Future, Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change. Check it out, everybody. It is available anywhere you can get your hands on a book. Thanks so much for joining us, Dolly.
Thank you so much for having me, Adrienne.